किया ना किया जिसने प्यार ना किया क्या किया क्या किया क्या किया जिसने प्यार ना किया आंखों को आंखों से किसी की चार ना किया क्या खाक हो जिया जिसने प्यार ना किया इजहार ना किया क्या खाक हो जिया जिसने प्यार ना किया दिलबर की आंखों का दीदार ना किया क्या खाक हो जिया जिसने प्यार ना किया ना किया ना किया जिसने प्यार ना किया क्या किया क्या किया क्या किया
April 1945, southern Germany near the Rhine. The air is still heavy with the smell of dust and burning timber. Ash drifts down like gray snow, settling on the twisted iron of what once were homes. Between the ruins, a long column of American Shermans grinds forward, their treads clicking and growling against broken cobblestones. The soldiers inside are silent, eyes scanning windows where no curtains move. On both sides of the street, the civilians stand. Old men in worn coats, women clutching children too weak to cry, faces pale from hunger and fear, eyes emptied by months of sirens, fire, and loss. No one cheers. No flags wave. Just silence. A silence deeper than defeat itself. Through the smoke, a soldier raises his camera. He hesitates before pressing the shutter. In that frozen second, two worlds meet. The victors of the most powerful army on earth and the people whose nation had promised them empire, now reduced to rubble and memory. The war is not yet over. But for Germany it already is. By the dawn of 1945, the Third Reich was dying. The empire that once stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow now existed only in fragments. A broken map of cities bombed into ash, armies cut off and retreating through snow and smoke. Hitler still raved in his Berlin bunker, drawing arrows across maps that no longer matched reality. But on the ground, Germany was finished. The failure of the Ardennes offensive, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, had sealed its fate. In December 1944, Hitler had gambled everything on a desperate counterattack through the frozen forest of Belgium. For a few days, the surprise worked. American lines broke and Allied command faltered. But the gamble burned out in blood and fuel. By January 1945, German tanks lay abandoned in the snow, their engines frozen, their crews surrendering one by one. The Wehrmacht was collapsing not from lack of courage, but from exhaustion. Its divisions were hollowed out, boys of 15, men of 60, pressed into Volkssturm battalions with no training, no fuel, and rifles older than they were. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, barely existed. Allied air power ruled the skies, turning every daylight movement into a risk of death. Behind the front, the German homeland was in ruins. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, relentless and methodical, had transformed industrial cities into wastelands. Cologne, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Kassel all burned. Entire districts flattened into moonscapes of bricks and smoke. By March, over 4 million civilians were homeless. Trains barely ran. Food rations had collapsed. Every night the sirens wailed. Every dawn the survivors pulled corpses from the rubble. Yet the regime demanded faith. Goebbels filled the airwaves with promises of wonder weapons, jets, rockets, miracle tanks that would turn the tide. The people listened not because they believed, but because they needed something to believe in. On the other side of the Rhine, American and British forces gathered for the final push. The U.S. 1st and 9th Armies under Generals Hodges and Simpson lined the western bank. Patton's Third Army, fierce and impatient, stood further south. The objective was simple: cross the Rhine, the last great natural barrier to the heart of Germany. But the crossing was not merely a military maneuver. It was the symbolic threshold between two worlds, from the occupied to the occupier's homeland, from retribution to reckoning. When the Americans reached Remagen in early March, they found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, a miracle of steel that the Germans had failed to demolish in time. Within hours, the Americans seized it. Armored columns poured across, establishing the first Allied bridgehead east of the Rhine. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. To the German people, it felt as though the Rhine, the river of legend, the river of German identity, had betrayed them. Soon, every front began to crack. In the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group pushed through the Ruhr. In the south, Patton's tanks surged toward the Main and the Danube. Town after town fell without resistance. Local mayors hoisted white sheets from shattered windows. The Reich's map was disintegrating, one village at a time. In those weeks, Germany became a landscape of ghosts. Soldiers retreating without orders, civilians wandering between ruins and empty roads. The Nazi administration, once total, had dissolved into chaos, yet propaganda still thundered on radios, urging the people to fight for the Führer to the last breath. But most had stopped believing. They no longer fought for victory. They fought for survival, or simply waited for the inevitable. By late March, the Americans were preparing to roll into the German heartland. The question was no longer if Germany would fall, but how it would face its own collapse. And as the engines started once more, another reality began to unfold. What awaited them on the other side of those rivers, behind the curtains of smoke? When the Rhine fell, the illusion of Germany's invincibility fell with it. The river that had once marked the western edge of empire, the frontier defended for centuries, was now a highway for American armor. The roar of engines and the rumble of tracks echoed across fields where, only months before, Nazi propaganda had promised the Endsieg, the final victory. In reality, the only victory left was survival. The American advance eastward was relentless, almost mechanical. Divisions that had once bled through the hedgerows of Normandy now moved like an industrial tide, precise, coordinated, unstoppable. Patton's Third Army cut through the Saarland. Hodges' First Army fanned north toward the Ruhr industrial basin, Germany's beating economic heart. Every bridge, every rail line, every factory mattered, not just for war, but for what would come after. Yet this was not conquest as the Germans had waged it. Eisenhower's command understood the delicate balance ahead, fighting an army while occupying a nation. The Supreme Commander had ordered strict discipline. No looting, no unnecessary destruction, no retaliation against civilians. America's power was to be shown not in vengeance but in restraint. Still, the line between war and peace blurred daily. As American convoys rolled into captured towns, they encountered scenes that defied comprehension. Streets were filled with refugees, entire families pushing handcarts of whatever they could save. Clocks, blankets, a photograph, sometimes a child's toy. German soldiers trudged alongside them, uniforms stripped of insignia, hoping to pass unnoticed. And always, the same silence. Unlike France or Belgium, there were no crowds to greet liberation. No flowers, no flags. The Germans did not celebrate. They observed. They watched their conquerors arrive through curtains of dust and disbelief. For the American soldiers, it was a strange sensation. To be both liberator and invader, cheered in one country, feared in the next. Many were young men from Iowa, Texas, or New York expecting fierce resistance. Instead, they found resignation. Some towns even left bread and milk at crossroads, desperate to avoid destruction. Behind them, the air war continued. Allied bombers pounded transport lines and depots, ensuring that retreat was impossible. Entire cities, Würzburg, Pforzheim, Dresden, were erased in firestorms that lit the night sky for miles. Each new inferno deepened the despair of a people already broken by years of total war. By April, the once proud Wehrmacht was fragmenting completely. Some units still fought with fanatic loyalty, particularly the SS, but most were surrendering en masse. Whole regiments laid down their arms to single American patrols. The Volkssturm, Hitler's last-ditch militia of civilians, disintegrated before it ever became a force. And through it all, the Nazi leadership retreated into delusion. Goebbels declared that surrender was treason, that death was preferable to defeat. Himmler attempted secret peace. Talks. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of betrayal as Soviet forces closed in from the east. But ordinary Germans no longer listened. Their world had already collapsed. As the Americans pushed deeper into Bavaria and Thuringia, they began to uncover a new, more terrible reality. Rumors spread among troops about camps, labor camps, concentration camps, places where the smoke from distant chimneys carried an odor no one could mistake. At first, few believed it. Then came Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, Dachau. The war was transforming from conquest into revelation. For the German civilians who watched the columns roll through, it was a reckoning they had not expected to witness. Many claimed ignorance. Others wept when shown what had been done in their name. Some simply turned away, unable to comprehend. Every road, every bridge taken by the Americans brought not just military victory, but moral confrontation. And as more towns surrendered without a shot, a new kind of silence settled over Germany, not just the silence of defeat, but the silence of awakening. This was the landscape in which those Americans advanced, a country burned, beaten, and waiting to face itself. And it was within this silence that the most haunting images of the war would unfold. The quiet surrender of a people who once believed themselves invincible. The human angle, the silence of the defeated, for the German civilians. April 1945 was not just the end of a war. It was the collapse of an entire belief system. Years of propaganda had taught them to see the Reich as eternal, a destiny carved in iron and sacrifice. But when the American tanks appeared on the horizon, that illusion disintegrated like smoke. In towns across Bavaria and Hesse, the silence that met the advancing troops was not merely fear, it was disbelief. Old men stood in the doorways of shattered houses, clutching photographs of sons lost on the Eastern Front. Women gathered children who no longer cried, their eyes dulled by hunger. The familiar sound of boots on cobblestones, once the march of their own soldiers, now echoed with a foreign rhythm. That silence spoke of shame as much as defeat. The German people had lived for years under an ideology that promised glory, that told them they were chosen, invincible. To watch their homeland occupied was to face a truth more painful than ruin, that the world they had built was built on lies. Yet even then, humanity flickered through the rubble. Civilians offered bread to American soldiers. A widow hung a white bedsheet as a flag of surrender. Children peeked from cellars at soldiers who smiled back, offering chocolate. Tiny gestures, insignificant against the backdrop of history, yet powerful reminders that even after total war, the human heart sought reconciliation. The war's great battles had been fought with steel and fire. But in those quiet streets, the greater struggle was internal, between guilt and survival, memory and denial. The tactical angle, the cautious advance to the American commanders. Germany in 1945 was still dangerous ground. Every house could conceal snipers, every cellar a last-ditch ambush. Patton's and Hodges' troops were veterans, tempered by Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Siegfried Line. They advanced with discipline, methodical precision, and a deep weariness born of too many campaigns. Each approach into a new town began the same way: reconnaissance patrols at dawn, then armored columns in staggered formation. Infantry followed, rifles ready but fingers hesitant on the triggers. Engineers checked bridges for explosives. Medics followed behind with trucks and stretchers. The towns were usually empty. Their defenders fled or surrendered, but the fear of traps kept everyone alert. The deeper the Americans moved, the less they fought and the more they witnessed. The landscape was a graveyard of machinery. Burned-out Panthers, wrecked half-tracks, artillery pieces pointing nowhere. The few German units that resisted did so with desperation rather than strategy. For Allied soldiers, the most haunting aspect was the absence of an enemy. The Wehrmacht that had once thundered across Europe now disintegrated into scattered groups. starving, leaderless, and terrified of both capture and the advancing Soviets behind them. To occupy a town without a fight was a relief, but also unsettling. Soldiers who had spent years under constant threat now walked through silent streets where no one looked them in the eye. The discipline Eisenhower demanded was tested not by combat, but by restraint. They were told, "You are not here to punish. You are here to finish the war." So they advanced carefully, not as conquerors, but as men aware they were stepping through the ruins of something colossal. The technological angle, the triumph of industry, the American advance across Germany was as much a triumph of logistics as of combat. Behind every tank column lay a vast invisible system. Engineers, fuel convoys, mobile repair shops, supply lines stretching back across France. It was war as industry, precise, mechanical, unstoppable. The Germans had built their war machine on ideology and fear. The Americans built theirs on production and efficiency. By 1945, that difference had become decisive. For every German tank that rolled off a factory line, the U.S. produced dozens. For every destroyed Sherman, another arrived within days. The sky itself belonged to the Allies. Fighter bombers patrolled constantly, their presence a constant psychological weapon. German troops could no longer move by day without being attacked from above. Even communication broke down. Radios crackled with static. Command orders rarely reached the front. Technological supremacy had turned the war from a struggle of armies into a slow-motion collapse of one nation's infrastructure. When the Americans rolled through cities like Mainz or Würzburg, they weren't just advancing militarily, they were advancing technologically, representing an era of mechanized warfare that Germany could no longer sustain. For civilians, the sight of endless convoys, trucks, jeeps, tanks, self-propelled guns was overwhelming. It wasn't just the noise or the dust. It was the realization that this was a scale of power their country could never match again. In that sense, the American columns represented not just an army, but the arrival of the modern world, a world where ideology could no longer outrun industry. And as those machines moved deeper into the Reich, they brought with them a new kind of order, a new kind of power, one that would soon reshape the world far beyond the ruins of Germany. The leadership angle, Eisenhower's burden, for General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Victory was already certain, but peace was not. He understood that the coming weeks would determine how history remembered the victors. His orders to his commanders were precise: discipline above vengeance, restraint above anger. Eisenhower had studied the lessons of 1918. He remembered how humiliation and occupation had once bred resentment, how the end of one war had sown the seeds of another. This time the Allied advance had to be different. The mission was not to destroy Germany. It was to end Nazism, to replace tyranny with structure, and to prevent chaos from consuming what remained of Europe. His headquarters at Rams and later at Frankfurt became nerve centers of coordination. He insisted on detailed reporting of civilian treatment. Any act of misconduct was punished swiftly. American soldiers were to represent not just strength, but justice, a message for both Germans and the watching world. Yet even Eisenhower could not contain the emotional toll. When reports began arriving from concentration camps, from Buchenwald, Dachau, Ohrdruf, he personally visited the sites. Witnesses described his expression as stone, his silence unbreakable. Later he would order journalists, film crews, and congressional delegations to document everything, fearing that some bastard will say this never happened. In Eisenhower's command, leadership was not about glory. It was about moral responsibility, to win the war without losing the soul of those who fought it. The enemy's view: surrender without words. By April, most German soldiers knew the end had come. Their officers whispered rumors. Berlin surrounded, Hitler unreachable, the Soviets taking revenge in the east. Every step westward was a plea for survival, to reach the Americans before the Red Army arrived. In the forests of Thuringia, in the hills of Bavaria, thousands of Wehrmacht troops abandoned their positions. Some carried white flags. Others simply threw away their weapons and walked toward the American lines with hands raised. The Americans called them the Gray Tide. For many of these men, surrender was not just a military act, it was a personal collapse. They had been raised in a world where obedience was virtue, where defeat was unthinkable. To surrender was to admit everything had been a lie. Captured soldiers often spoke little. Some wept when given food. A few tried to justify the war. Others stared blankly at the ground. The SS, however, fought to the last, driven by fanaticism and fear of retribution. Small firefights erupted in isolated pockets, often ending with suicide rather than capture. American troops learned to distinguish quickly: the weary Wehrmacht conscript who only wanted to go home, and the black uniformed zealot who would die for a lost cause. And behind these soldiers stood the civilian population, confused, silent, uncertain whether to grieve or to hope. Their sons were prisoners. Their homes were gone. Their leaders had vanished. Surrender had come not as an act of negotiation, but as an act of exhaustion. The Reich had demanded loyalty unto death. Now it received only silence. The moral angle, between victory and guilt, the deeper the Americans moved into Germany, the heavier the air seemed to become. Not from battle, but from realization. Every village had its stories. Some citizens claimed they had known nothing of the crimes committed in their name. Others said they suspected but dared not ask. The evidence, however, left no room for denial. When soldiers liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945, they found thousands of corpses, and thousands more barely alive. The stench of death lingered in the air and the soil in the walls. Nearby villagers were ordered to walk through the camp. Many wept, some fainted. Others stared in numb disbelief. For the Americans, victory lost its sense of triumph. The moral gravity of what they witnessed altered everything. War, which had once seemed like duty, now felt like confrontation with something deeper, with what humanity was capable of when hatred replaced reason. Some soldiers wrote home that they no longer felt proud. They felt responsible not just for ending the war, but for proving that civilization could still exist after such darkness. This, perhaps, was the truest silence of all, the silence of men realizing that no victory could erase what they had seen. In the months ahead, that silence would define both nations. For the Germans, it was a silence of guilt and survival. For the Americans, it was a silence of reflection, a burden carried home by every soldier who had walked through those ruins. And as the tanks rolled onward, toward the final strongholds of Nuremberg and Munich, both sides knew the last shots of the war would not just end an empire, they would end an era of belief itself. By April 1945, Germany was bleeding from every direction. In the east, the Red Army surged across the Oder toward Berlin. In the west, the Americans and British drove through the shattered spine of the Reich. Between them lay the last fragments of Hitler's empire, cities reduced to rubble, armies reduced to memories. In Bavaria, Patton's Third Army advanced with relentless precision. The towns of Aschaffenburg, Schweinfurt, and Würzburg were taken after short, brutal fighting. Würzburg, once a jewel of Baroque architecture, burned for days after Allied bombing and street battles. When American troops entered, they found a city that no longer existed, only stone and smoke. Everywhere they went, they saw the same thing: a population too weary to resist, too proud to beg. In Frankfurt, the bridges across the Main lay twisted and collapsed, yet civilians still crossed on makeshift planks to search for relatives. In Kassel, entire neighborhoods were nothing but foundations. In Stuttgart, people emerged from air raid shelters as if from tombs. The American commanders knew the war's end was near, but the danger had not passed. Pockets of fanatic resistance still flared. SS units refused to surrender, retreating into forests or barricading inside towns. Each day brought skirmishes that claimed lives even when victory was certain. On April 1st, the Ruhr pocket closed. More than 300,000 German troops were trapped. Within 2 weeks, they surrendered, one of the largest capitulations in history. For the Allies, it was the final death blow to German military power. For the Germans, it was the moment they realized the war had become meaningless. As the American columns pressed south, they entered regions untouched by battle since the war's early days. These were places where the myth of the Reich had lingered: Bavaria, Thuringia, Saxony. In these quiet valleys, the contrast was haunting. Churches still stood. Fields were green with spring, yet under that peace lay the ruins of belief. In one small Bavarian town, American soldiers found Nazi banners still hanging from windows, faded but untouched. The townspeople had not removed them, not from loyalty, but from fear. Removing them too soon might be seen as betrayal. Leaving them might be seen as defiance, so they chose paralysis. The deeper the Americans moved, the more surreal it became. Hitler's portrait still hung in schools. Party offices still displayed slogans urging resistance. Yet the people had already surrendered inside. At the same time, German radio continued to broadcast propaganda from Berlin, promising miracle weapons and final victory. In some towns, loudspeakers repeated Goebbels' defiance even as American tanks rolled through the streets. Reality and delusion coexisted side by side, but the illusion ended with Nuremberg. Once the heart of Nazi ideology, the city of rallies, banners, and declarations of destiny, Nuremberg became a battlefield. The Americans fought block by block against remnants of SS and Hitler youth. The swastika that had once symbolized absolute power was now buried under dust. When the city finally fell on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, it felt as though history itself had turned its back on him. For the German people, it was an unspoken realization. The symbols, the parades, the speeches, all had led here. To silence, to rubble, to surrender. Meanwhile, word spread that Hitler was still in Berlin, refusing to leave his bunker. His speeches had become whispers, his armies myths. The Reich he had promised to last 1,000 years would not survive the month. For the Americans on the ground, each new victory felt less like triumph and more like relief. They were finishing something enormous, something that had consumed the world, and they were eager for it to end. But as they advanced toward Munich, the city where the Nazi story had begun, they were about to uncover what it had cost. Ahead of them lay the camps, and with them, the moment when the war's true meaning would reveal itself, not in the noise of battle, but in the unbearable stillness that followed. They were only a few miles outside Munich when the rumors solidified into orders, advanced toward Dachau. For days, soldiers in Patton's Third Army had heard whispers of a camp, of prisoners, of something unspeakable behind the barbed wire. Most dismissed it as propaganda or misunderstanding. After years of war, imagination could no longer outdo what they had already seen. But nothing had prepared them for what awaited. On April 29, 1945, elements of the U.S. 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions reached the gates of Dachau. The first thing they noticed was the smell, thick, metallic, unmistakable. Then came the silence, the kind that follows suffering too great for words. When they entered, they found over 30,000 inmates. Thousands were dead, their bodies stacked beside railway cars. Others were alive but skeletal, their eyes sunken, their movements ghost-like. The liberators, hardened by years of battle, fell into stunned disbelief. Nearby in the town of Dachau itself, the civilians claimed they had known nothing. But the smoke from the chimneys had risen for years. The trains had arrived every week. The guards had come from their streets. The Americans ordered the townspeople to see. Men and women who had lived within sight of the camp gates were marched through the barbed wire. Many broke down in tears. Others turned away, faces blank as if their minds could not accept what their eyes had seen. That same week in central Germany, another revelation unfolded at Buchenwald near Weimar. When the 6th Armored Division entered, they found tens of thousands of corpses and survivors clinging to life. American officers wept openly. General Eisenhower himself visited the camp days later. His report was terse, factual, and cold, because no words could convey what he had seen. He ordered photographs, film reels, and documentation. "Let the world see," he said, "so no one can ever deny it." For the soldiers, these discoveries changed everything. They had fought an enemy they thought they understood. A military machine, a political ideology. Now they saw what that ideology had truly created. The victory they had dreamed of suddenly felt hollow. One sergeant wrote home, "We thought we were ending a war. We didn't know we were walking into the heart of hell." Elsewhere, in towns surrounding Munich, Americans uncovered smaller camps and forced labor sites, remnants of a vast network of exploitation that had fed the Reich's war machine. Civilians were forced to bury the dead. Prisoners who could still walk staggered into the sunlight for the first time in years, blinking like men from another world. This was not the victory of flags and anthems. It was the victory of witness. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the end had arrived. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Hitler remained in his bunker, issuing phantom orders to armies that no longer existed. On April 30th, he took his own life. The next day, German radio announced that the Führer had fallen fighting at the head of his troops. Even then, truth was too dangerous to speak plainly. When the Americans heard the news, reactions were subdued. There was no cheering. The war in Europe was nearly over, but no one felt celebration. The enormity of what they had seen made victory feel small. As May approached, German resistance evaporated completely. Soldiers surrendered in droves. Towns raised white sheets over rooftops. The last columns of the Wehrmacht marched westward to surrender, desperate to escape the advancing Soviets. On May 7th, in Reims, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The guns finally fell silent on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. In New York and London, crowds filled the streets in joy. But in the ruins of Germany, there was no celebration, only stillness. American soldiers walked through cities where the wind carried the smell of dust and fire. German civilians moved like shadows among the wreckage of homes, searching for bread, for water, for something to begin again. The war had ended, but the silence remained, a silence that carried all the weight of guilt, grief, and disbelief. And as the occupying troops settled into the devastated towns, the world's greatest army found itself facing a question no weapon could answer. What comes after victory, when the enemy is no longer an army, but an entire nation shattered by its own beliefs? That question would shape not only Germany's future but the moral landscape of the century that followed. May 8, 1945. The guns were silent. After 6 years, the deadliest war in human history was over. But Europe looked nothing like peace. Germany lay in ruins. Cities once proud of their industry and culture had become mountains of debris. In Berlin, the Reich Chancellery was a crater of concrete and twisted rebar. In Hamburg and Cologne, whole districts were flattened, their streets unrecognizable. Munich, where the Nazi movement had been born, was now a city of broken statues and hollow-eyed survivors. The numbers defied comprehension. Over 7 million Germans were dead. Millions more were displaced, refugees from the east fleeing the Red Army, carrying what little they could in carts and sacks. Roads were clogged with civilians, old women pushing bicycles, children dragging blankets, former soldiers in rags. It was a migration born not of conquest but of collapse. The Allied occupation zones took shape quickly. Germany was divided into 4 regions: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, though deep in Soviet territory, was divided the same way. The lines drawn on maps in London and Yalta now materialized on the ground, cutting through towns, rivers, and families. For the Americans, the mission had changed overnight. Soldiers who had fought as warriors now became administrators, peacekeepers, and witnesses. Eisenhower's orders were clear: maintain order, provide humanitarian aid where possible, but hold the line on justice. The occupation was not to be an act of vengeance. It was to be the foundation of reconstruction. The first challenge was hunger. By summer, German food production had collapsed. Farmland was destroyed, transport networks shattered. The American army began distributing rations to civilians, not out of charity, but necessity. A starving population could not rebuild or be governed. In some towns, former German soldiers were used to clean debris or repair roads under Allied supervision. The next challenge was identity. The Allies launched the denazification program, an immense effort to remove Nazi influence from every aspect of life. Party members were dismissed from government posts, teachers were screened, local officials were interrogated. Town by town, citizens were required to fill out questionnaires about their wartime roles. Many claimed ignorance or coercion. Some were executed for war crimes. Others quietly returned to work months later. But the greatest obstacle was not physical or administrative. It was psychological. A nation raised on the myth of superiority now faced the moral abyss of its own actions. For years, the population had lived under propaganda that dehumanized their enemies and sanctified obedience. The sudden exposure of the regime's crimes, the camps, the exterminations, the mass graves, shattered what remained of collective pride. American soldiers observed it firsthand. They saw villagers crying in disbelief at photographs of Buchenwald and Dachau. They saw priests confess that they had not wanted to know. They saw young Germans growing up amid ruins, their first understanding of the world shaped by defeat and guilt. Yet even in devastation there was resilience. Churches reopened. Markets returned, selling what little food could be found. Families gathered to rebuild homes from bricks salvaged from the wreckage. Children played between burned-out tanks as if war were just another landscape. Among the occupying troops, emotions were complex. Some felt pity. Others felt disgust. Many simply felt tired. The men who had crossed the Rhine as soldiers were now writing letters home about orphaned children and homeless families. They gave away their rations, shared cigarettes with civilians, taught kids English words. For them, victory was no longer about conquest. It was about proving that civilization could return to a place where it had once died, and slowly, amid the ashes, order began to return, not imposed by fear, but by the quiet persistence of survival. Yet under that surface of reconstruction, deeper forces were beginning to move. The first tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviets, the first shadows of a new kind of conflict. Because even as Germany's ruins cooled, the world was already dividing again. By the end of 1945, the sound of gunfire had faded, but the echoes of war still haunted every street, every mind, every silence. Germany was not merely occupied. It was dismantled, politically, militarily, and spiritually. In the American zone, military governance took on an unfamiliar shape, half justice, half compassion. General Lucius D. Clay, Eisenhower's deputy and later the U.S. military governor, faced an impossible task: to rebuild a nation while holding it accountable for its crimes. "We are not here to punish," he said, "but to prevent the past from returning." Factories were inspected, political organizations disbanded, symbols of the Nazi era erased. Streets once named after Hitler and Goering were quietly renamed after poets, scientists, or local saints. Yet beneath this new surface, the scars of ideology remained deep. Civilians lived in a strange limbo. They were no longer at war, but not yet free. Every day was survival. Food lines, ration cards, makeshift stoves built from scrap metal. Allied soldiers and German citizens shared the same towns, but existed in different worlds. Relationships formed, sometimes forbidden, sometimes inevitable. Out of tragedy grew a fragile humanity. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. In the very city where the Reich had once celebrated its power, its architects now sat in the dock: Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel. The courtroom became the stage of moral judgment. For the first time in history, leaders were tried not as conquerors but as criminals. The evidence was overwhelming: films, photographs, testimonies of survivors. The German public watched in stunned silence. Many had believed that justice would never come, or that the crimes were too vast to comprehend. Now they saw the faces of those who had led them to ruin, defiant, broken, or indifferent. The myth of infallible leadership disintegrated in that courtroom. Meanwhile, new lines were being drawn. In the East, Soviet authorities imposed their own order, one built on ideology rather than reconstruction. Entire communities were uprooted, industries dismantled and shipped to Russia as reparations. Refugees streamed westward in millions, fleeing hunger and repression. The Western zones, under American and British influence, began to follow a different path. Schools reopened under new curricula. Newspapers reemerged, this time free of censorship. Radio stations broadcast jazz and news of democracy. Small businesses were allowed to resume. It was the slow resurrection of civic life, fragile, cautious, and uncertain. By 1946, a new enemy had replaced the old. Suspicion grew between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Cooperation gave way to rivalry. The same Germany that had torn the world apart now became the dividing line between two emerging superpowers. The Iron Curtain descended, not with the sound of guns, but with the quiet firmness of political will. In the American sector, hope began to stir. Soldiers who once came as conquerors now became protectors, helping rebuild schools, restoring electricity, teaching children how to read English newspapers. Aid packages arrived from across the Atlantic, marked with unfamiliar generosity: flour, blankets, milk powder. Among the ruins, a new generation began to grow. Children who knew nothing of Hitler, who learned instead about democracy, music, and freedom. But the memory of silence never left. For decades, post-war Germany would wrestle with its conscience, between remembering and forgetting, between guilt and renewal. Monuments would rise, books would be written, and every stone of every rebuilt city would carry the echo of what had been lost. For the Americans, too, the experience left deep marks. The men who marched through the ruins had seen the best and worst of humanity. They returned home not as heroes of triumph, but as witnesses to tragedy. Their victory had been necessary, but never simple. And as the last U.S. columns withdrew years later, they left behind not conquered land but the foundation of something enduring, a nation forced to confront its past, and to rebuild upon truth rather than myth. The ruins would eventually be cleared, the cities rebuilt and the flags replaced. But beneath the quiet streets and the new walls, the memory of that spring in 1945 would remain, when American tanks rolled through silence, and a people watched their own history crumble before their eyes. In the spring of 1945, as the smoke drifted above the broken cities of Germany, the war that had consumed the world finally fell silent. That silence, light, heavy, endless, and absolute, became the sound of truth. For the German people, it was the moment when illusion gave way to consequence. They had watched the symbols of their faith crumble into dust, their armies dissolve, their leaders vanish. The streets that once echoed with marching boots now lay empty, filled only with the hum of American engines and the whisper of wind through shattered glass. For the Americans, it was a silence of reckoning. They had come as liberators and conquerors, but they left as witnesses to what happens when ideology replaces humanity, when obedience becomes morality, when nations forget the value of life itself. In that meeting of victors and vanquished, something deeper than victory emerged. It was not triumph that defined that moment, but awareness that civilization is fragile, that progress is not guaranteed, that evil can grow in ordinary streets beneath ordinary flags. The ruins of 1945 were more than a battlefield's aftermath. They were a mirror, showing humanity what it was capable of and what it must never become again. From those ashes, Germany would rise again, not through conquest, but through confession and rebuilding. And the soldiers who once rolled through its silence would return home knowing that history's greatest victories are not won by weapons, but by remembering. So when we see those black and white photographs, American tanks crawling through broken towns, civilians standing still among the debris, we are not seeing defeat. We are seeing a lesson written in stone and shadow, that power fades, empires fall, and silence is sometimes the only language left for the end of a world.